I'm about to drive out to Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. I'm going to get there in time for sunrise, and I've set a goal for myself to photograph all 10 elements of composition in one day. And whether there's more than 10 elements of composition or maybe fewer, there's no denying that these 10 concepts are critical to the way that you compose your photos. And those are, I have a list because otherwise I won't remember, points, lines, shapes, texture, color, tone, distance, balance, space, and patterns. And the last four I'm putting up in a different color because they're more about relationships rather than the physical items that appear in your composition. Now, while I'm photographing these, I'm going to give you a ton of amazing tips for composing your photos. Or maybe I'll just ramble too much about the weather. Only one way to find out. I guess the first item on my list is points. And it really is a beautiful morning. There's no denying it's also extremely cold right now. I maybe should have stayed in the car. Okay, element of composition number one, point, is just absolutely staring me in the face. It's right up there, it's the moon. All right, one down and 9 to go. But you might be wondering why points are so important as an element of composition in the first place. And the answer really is just that they draw attention. They kind of pull in your eye. And that's true whether it's something like the moon, where it's just one single solitary subject, or something that I'll be able to show you real soon, which is where two or more lines meet, like the point of a sand dune. In either case, the viewer's eye is going to be drawn to that part of your photo, which obviously has a very important effect on how you want to compose the image. Do you want that point to be centered? Do you want it off-center? Do you want it to balance other items in the photo? Regardless of what you choose, it's very important to keep those points in mind. They draw attention more than almost any other element of composition. Oh man. My cheeks are starting to get numb. I don't think I'm going to sound like a human by the end of this video. I'm not sure if I do right now. Good morning, Colorado. I didn't expect to see such an awesome pattern so early, but I'm going to jump down the list all the way to patterns because this is a really, really cool one. The shadows almost look like trees here, and the way that they repeat each other makes for a very interesting composition. That was pretty awesome. I didn't really expect to be talking about patterns so early in this video, and I will cover more about it later on, but I couldn't pass up that opportunity. So next up, I'm going to try to find some more lines, shapes, and textures, and then I'll get into some of the more complicated stuff. Well, I think this one's pretty cool. It's a good example of texture. You can definitely see here that we've got kind of a rounded, maybe even a swirly texture in the sand, and it creates a very interesting mood to the photos. There's a big difference between some texture like this versus perhaps a very jagged or harsh texture. Here we're definitely going to get photos that feel peaceful, kind of calm. I'm going to take a few here. I like this look personally, but you can compare it to photos with a much more harsh texture, and you can see how the emotions of your photo are going to be very different in either case. Now, you can't always choose what textures are going to be in your photo. If you're at a landscape overlook and there's a harsh, jagged mountain in front of you, that's the texture that you're going to get in your photo. But what you can do is compose your photo and post-process your photo in a way that emphasizes the jaggedness and the harshness and kind of unifies your photo around that message. That's kind of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to create a peaceful image because that works well with the textures that I've got here. Well, it got warmer a little bit, finally. I'm still only about halfway up the dunes. These things are tall. I always forget how tall they are. And here's a good example of a line in photography. You can see here that we've got this cool line going from the sand dune in the foreground to the mountain in the distance. And what it does is kind of draw a viewer's eye from the foreground of this photo to the background. And that's a very common way to use lines in landscape photography. Here's just a few more examples. And as you can see, this gives the photo a sense of internal structure and unity that it might otherwise be lacking. Lines just draw a viewer's eye from one part of the photo to another. Well, one that took me an embarrassing amount of time to find was just shapes. You'd think that it'd be super easy because these are sand dunes and there's shapes everywhere. But I wanted a good photo, and I wanted one that really illustrates the two important things that shapes can do in your photo. And I think that I found it. Now you can see that we've got two different sets of footprints here, one leading up the sand dune and one leading down it. And the sand dune itself has kind of a peak. It's a point because two of the lines are meeting each other. And in this case, the overall whole forms almost a diamond shape, and that is the basis of my composition. So shapes can kind of play two roles. They can be a subject or they can be a structure. For example, in this photo that I took earlier today, the shapes are elements of the composition. But in the photo in front of me with the diamond shape, that diamond is actually the composition itself. Well, I'm back at my car. I'd say that this morning was a pretty big success. I've gotten 5 out of the 10 photos. And then the remaining pictures I still need to take are color, tone, balance, distance, and space. And once I've done those, I'll have done all 10 elements of composition in 24 hours. So I'm going to take a quick break for lunch and maybe a nap, and then I'll get back to the rest at sunset. Well, I just found the perfect example for space. Right as I was walking up to the dunes, I saw this couple at the very top of them, way in the distance, and only with my telephoto lens, all the way zoomed into 200 millimeters, can you even tell that there are people in this photo. And to me, this is the perfect example of space. Now, there's two types of space in photography. There's positive and then negative space. And positive space is anything that attracts your eye. For example, on a sheet of paper, positive space would be the letters in a word. And the negative space is anything that fades into the background, for example, like the paper itself. Now, if you have a photo with a ton of negative space, like this one, then it has a very lonely and isolated feel. And this might not sound like an amazing emotion to convey in a photo, but oftentimes it works extremely well. And then the opposite would be if you've got a ton of positive space in your composition. And that can also work really well. It kind of gives your photo a more chaotic and crowded feel, but not always necessarily in a bad way. I use it all the time for cityscape photos, for example. So yeah, a perfect example of space, especially negative space. This photo feels isolated, like the landscape around these people is gigantic, and that's exactly the emotions that I wanted to convey. Now I better get going quickly because the sun is about to set and I still have 4 more photos to take. Now here's an example that I really like for color. Right here I've got this really interesting ice in the foreground, and because the sun is right about to set, it's leaving these very cool orange versus deep blue patterns. And that's one of the most important things to know about color in photography. It's that warm versus cool distinction. Warm colors are red, yellow, orange, and cool colors are greens, blues, and purples. And the big difference is that warm colors are much more likely to attract our eye, and if you've got both types in one photo, a warm color and a cool color, it creates almost a color contrast. The tones themselves, the brightness levels, don't need to be any different between the colors, and yet if you have a photo with both warm and cool in it, you'll end up with some subjects that really pop out of their surroundings compared to what you'd normally get. Man, it's getting dark. I better do this quickly. I've got 2 subjects behind me. I have a tree and a mountain. And I'm photographing both of them because this time I'm trying to capture balance. And in this case, both the tree and the mountain are roughly equally similar in how much visual attention they attract. In other words, they have the same amount of visual weight. So when I composed my photo right when the sun was setting, I took this picture so that the tree was on the left and the mountain was on the right, and both of them are roughly equidistant from the center. Now, as I've talked about before in my video on how to take good pictures with any camera, balance is one of the most important topics in photography, and that's because it affects the emotional impact of your photo. Now, in this case, because I wanted a peaceful photo, I aimed for maximum balance when I was composing my shot. And the way to do that is essentially to assign every item in your photo, however big or small, some amount of visual weight. And then assume that you're putting your photograph on a fulcrum. Whichever way the photo leans, left or right, that's the direction that it's balanced towards. And in this case, I just wanted a balanced composition, so I put one subject on each side of the center. Okay, so only two more to go, distance and tone. And I think that I've got a pretty good idea of what to shoot for both of them. So let's go. All right, I made it back to my car, and I'm actually going to explain the importance of tone and distance when I get back to my studio at home, just because it's already getting so dark and I'm pretty sure that the video quality sucks right now. But real quick, I am still planning to take those two photos tonight, and my plans are pretty simple. For tone, my goal is just to drive down a road and photograph the lights on my car illuminating the road at night. And then for distance, my goal is to photograph the Milky Way over the sand dunes as it moves across the sky. So hopefully that'll work. Let's see how it goes. Well, that was quite a day. I set out to photograph the 10 elements of composition in 24 hours. But did I get the last two? Well, let's start with tone. That one turned out pretty well. As you can see, the lights from my car really emphasize this leading line from the foreground to the background. And that leading line is what makes this photo so relevant to the topic of tones. In fact, if I had taken this same photo, but without my car lighting up the road would still be a leading line. It would just be much darker. It'd be very hard to see and not very effective. The light is what makes it work. And that's one of the important things about tones. Brighter regions of a photo typically attract more attention. And the same is also true of areas with high contrast. And you can adjust all these variables in different ways, either with your camera settings or in post-processing. But either way, it's important to note that the range of tones in your photo has a very big impact on the emotions that the picture has. Darker photos tend to obscure more of your subject, which can give you more of a mysterious or intense photo, or even a very refined photo. And then brighter photos tend to be more ethereal and optimistic. So that brings us to the final element of composition. I got 9 so far. What about number 10, distance? Well, this is where I stumbled. My plan was to shoot a time lapse of the Milky Way over the sand dunes and demonstrate how the different positions of the Milky Way led to a different character for the photo. But clouds rolled in almost immediately, and well, these are the only 2 photos that I got. So instead, I'll show you the same demonstration, but from photos that I took a few months ago. Here they are. Now pay attention to the position of the Milky Way, and more specifically, its distance away from the mountain. In the first photo, the Milky Way is almost directly over the mountain, and it really connects the 2 subjects. In the second photo, it's farther away, more like there are 2 main subjects to the photo. And I'm not saying that either photo is better, but I'm sure that you can see how the distance between these subjects, the mountain and the Milky Way, changes the overall structure of the photo. There's also much simpler examples. Sometimes one of your subjects will be way too close to the edge of the photo, and it'll look distracting. Or 2 subjects could be too close to one another. Either way, distance is one of those qualities that you can change pretty easily by moving around or using different lenses and experimenting with your composition. Now, last but not least, I said that I'd go back to patterns and talk about why they work so well. And the answer isn't anything fancy, they just tie a photo together. That's true of something complicated like the patterns that I saw on the sand dunes, and it's also true of even something as simple as a mountain reflected in the water. Any repeated element in a photo counts, at least at some level, as a pattern. Now the real key here is that all 10 of these elements of composition are interrelated. When you have points, you probably have lines. When you have lines, maybe you have patterns or interesting textures. So next time that you're out taking pictures, I'm challenging you to think about these elements of composition and how they show up in the photos that you're taking. Bring them to the surface. Put some thought into your compositions. Photography usually requires active decision making, and the elements of composition are one of the best places to begin.